Using $7 worth of material, I was able to hack together a zero clearance insert for this Grizzly G0771Z saw. Grizzly gives you two insert plates. The one on the right is for dado blades. The one on the left is for a standard 1/8 inch blade. The problem with this insert, like many, is that there's not a lot of support around the blade. There's about a ½ inch worth of gap. About a ½ inch on either side of the blade is unsupported. So if you were to make a ½ inch cut, there's nothing supporting that offcut by the blade, and it'll probably just fall right down to your saw. Zero clearance insert provides support right up to the blade itself. So this is basically just an epoxy pour with super cheap epoxy. The first step is to take some strips of wood and lay them out around the opening in the insert to create a sort of trough to catch the epoxy when you pour it. You can see some marker lines. Once I laid out the pieces of wood where I wanted them, I came back with a marker and marked them so I could orient them back in the same spot. Then I took some sandpaper and roughed up where those pieces of wood would go and just epoxied them down. After that dried, I flipped the insert over and put a piece of tape or two over the opening in the insert so the epoxy wouldn't pour out. Flipped it back on its underside, and then I just mixed up 2 batches of this 1 ounce 2-part epoxy from Harbor Freight. The trick is to really mix it thoroughly before you pour it. The left side, you can see it's shiny and kind of hard. That mixed very well. On the right side, there's some parts where it's very dull. That's where the resin and the hardener didn't mix very completely. Not really a structural problem, but just make sure you take the time to mix it and pour it. You do have to move sort of fast, though. Put the insert in with the riving knife removed and raise the blade up to cut the initial slot. To extend the space for the riving knife, you have to use a router or a router table. I used a router table and I cut the slot just a little bit bigger when I was widening it than the blade. Not a problem. I doubt that 1/32 of an inch is ever going to be a problem for me, but it's just a little bit wider than a true zero clearance insert. The only thing I had to do when the epoxy fully cured was to take a chisel to some spots and just make sure they were flush with the red part of the insert plate, and that did not take too long at all. The only real concern that I had, and some of you may have, is how strong that tiny slice of epoxy is going to be. I think it's a non-issue because the load is never on top of that slice of epoxy. When you're passing something over a blade, it's usually hitting the cast iron, the red part of the insert, then it passes over the epoxy and then goes on. So there's never really that much of weight on top of that little slice. But overall, this was a $7 hack to make a zero clearance insert plate instead of buying one for $40. So I'll stick with this one.